Hello, this is Scott Sterling, and I'm here today with Stephen Hackett of the Biblical Studies and Review YouTube channel, and also a instructor with the Biblical Mastery Academy. And we're discussing today the reaffirmation of Peter off of John 21:15 through 17. The reason I wanted to do this is because back in 1982, when I was 23, 24 years old, uh, I was in a midweek Bible study, and the pastor thought it would be a good idea to turn his midweek Bible study into a Greek class. And the first verse that we studied was the reaffirmation of Peter. And at that time, I had no idea that they were not saying the same word for love. And I wondered what else I was missing. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on this passage?
Yeah, it's a very interesting passage, and as you say, there's quite a bit of controversy that swirls around it. There was a time when probably the majority of scholarship would see a distinction in the words that Peter uses versus the word that uses. So Jesus asked the question three times, Peter, do you love me? That's how it is in our English version. And Peter responds each time. But what most translations don't bring out is that there is this difference in words that Jesus uses versus what Peter uses. So Jesus wants to use the word agapao, whereas Jesus uses that twice at least, and then Peter's going to respond with the Greek word phileo. And so, is there a distinction in those words? Some people have argued the older view, I'm talking about in the 19th century, people would argue that Jesus is saying, "Do you have this divine love for me, this godlike love for me?" And Peter's responding and saying, "No, he says, 'Yes, Lord,' but he responds with, I have this lower form of love for you," is kind of the idea, until finally Jesus, the third time, asked him, Peter, do you have even this lower form of love for me? That's how it was sort of portrayed by some writers. And there have been at least four arguments in recent times that have been leveled against this view that there's a massive distinction between these two verbs. The first argument is that John seems to use these words interchangeably. The second argument is uh, that the Hebrew and Aramaic lack the same distinction that these two Greek words might have. So if Peter is speaking Aramaic, for example, then, you know, we wouldn't have the same sort of way to distinguish between what would be supposed as the higher love versus this lower love. The third objection would be that Peter answers yes all three times. So, yes, Lord, I do love you. That would be an odd thing if he's not claiming to have this higher love. The fourth argument is it seems like when you get to the last instance and he says that, Jesus has asked him this three times, it's interesting because Jesus has used the same verb two times and has used Peter's verb the third time. So it's odd that he would say that Jesus has said this three times if they're not being used synonymously. So those are the four major arguments that have been leveled against the view that was very popular in the 19th century. And I think those are formidable arguments and definitely worthy of consideration. Does that make sense what I'm saying there, Scott?
Yes. And like I was talking to you before about Dr. Rob Plummer with Daily Dose of Greek, talking about the near synonyms that John always uses.
Right, right. And that's another point that's used here is that Jesus is using words that are pretty close to synonyms um in this passage. He goes from feeding to shepherding, from lambs to sheep, and that would be another argument that's often used. So one of the I think one aspect that needs to be considered here is that this is a case study in D.A. Carson's book, Exegetical Fallacies. And I'm sure that's influenced a lot of people. You know, nobody wants to make an exegetical fallacy. And this has been sort of a very prominent book in that regard. And he points us out, and he points out the other near synonyms. And he says, but very few preachers judge these changes to be of fundamental importance to the meaning of the passages. It, sorry, to the meaning of the passage. One can show that there is some difference between lambs and sheep when the totality of their respective semantic ranges is taken into account. Similarly, there is a difference between to shepherd and to feed. But he sort of downplays the idea that preachers really take this into account when they're preaching through a passage like this. They'll emphasize the difference between the forms of love, but not take into account some of these others. But I will say that despite D.A. Carson and probably the majority of scholarship shifting on this, there are a number of scholars who still hold to this view that was popular in the 19th century. And so there's been some pushback on this. And one of those scholars would be Rodney Whitaker. And I'll give you a quote from Rodney Whitaker here. He says, in the past, it was common to find a great distinction between these two words. But in recent years, the idea that they are close synonyms has come to prevail. And then he actually cites Carson, and I think he's actually citing his pillar commentary there. The older idea that agapao is divine love and phileo, a lower human love, does indeed go too far. So Whitaker's prepared to say, yes, that goes too far. For both verbs are used of the love of the Father for the Son, and agapao can be used of false love. For example, the love of the world, and he cites 2 Timothy 4:10. So a simple distinction between the verbs is not justified. But this does not mean that there is no distinction at all. For in this passage, there is a pattern, with Jesus asking Peter twice whether he loves him, agapao, and each time Peter responding that yes, he does love him, phileo. Then the third time, Jesus switches to using Peter's word. Such a pattern suggests there is a distinction here. So there are scholars, Whitaker being one of them, that would kind of push back on this idea.
And just for the viewers of my channel that may not know, Whitaker is a Greek scholar and has his own Greek grammar and everything like this, right?
Yeah, that's right. He is a scholar specialized in Greek, and so his opinion here isn't just someone shooting from the hip, as it were. This is a serious scholar, and yes, he's well known, and people who've studied Greek, a very well known scholar. So there's others. I would mention that N.T. Wright in 2004, his book on John for Everyone, he sort of played down this idea, but interestingly, in his massive The New Testament in Its World, he actually puts quite a bit of emphasis there on this point that to him, he sees this as one love being this sort of um, uh, higher love, if you will, and then the other one kind of referring to this love of affection or friendship. And so it's interesting. I would have a lot of disagreements with N.T. Wright, but he's a well-known scholar. But I think if people are interested in the view that there is a distinction between these two words, they should look at the work of Linsky, Linsky's commentary on John. He does a very good job of addressing some of the objections, and so that he addresses the idea that there's no Aramaic distinction. He talks about how these two verbs are used and where they don't overlap. And so he really addresses some of these four major concerns. Now, myself, I really feel the full force of those objections I laid out at the beginning, and so I think it could be Carson might be right. They're just being used as near synonyms. That could be the case, but it does seem to me, I'm a person who's really read and enjoyed C.S. Lewis's book, The Four Loves, and if you've read that book, it's hard for you not to feel the full force of the other opinion too, that there could be some sort of distinction here. So if a person's interested in seeing can these objections be overcome that Carson lays out, and really somebody like Raymond Brown, can those objections be overcome? I think looking at Linsky's work is interesting here. So at the very end, I'm not 100% sure where I would land on this, but I think it's an interesting thing. And if you don't study Greek, if you don't look at the Greek, you wouldn't even know there's a controversy here to be had. There's something here to investigate. And so I think it's a worthy enterprise to kind of see if you can look at, if you're able to, if you can look at the text, or if someone has time to do some study in Greek, it's definitely worth your while, because then at least you can engage with the various arguments that scholars are having about this. So at the end of the day, maybe Carson's right, maybe Whitaker's right, but I think it's really interesting because it drives us into the text more, and makes us want to delve a little deeper into what the Lord has given us in His Word.
And earlier when we were talking about this, you mentioned was it A.T. Robinson?
Yeah, A.T. Robertson. Yeah. So A.T. Robertson, he actually, I could quote him here. Uh, Christ probes the inmost recesses of Peter's heart to secure the humility necessary for service. I love thee. And then he cites the Greek words. Peter makes no claim here to superior love and passes by the more than these. He puts that in quotation marks, and does not even use Christ's word, agapao, for high and devoted love, but the humbler word, phileo, for love as a friend. He insists that Christ knows this in spite of his conduct. So A.T. Robertson, eminent New Testament scholar and expert in Greek grammar, in his word pictures of the New Testament, also would take this view. And so I don't think it's one that can just be lightly dismissed as some people do. I think it's worthy of at least consideration.
Yeah, thank you for this. And you've also had times to get to know Dr. Robinson, uh, Robinson Pierpoint, right?
Yeah, Dr. Maurice Robinson. Yes, I've had him.
Mhm.
He's been on my YouTube channel, and great scholar, very
Right,
interesting scholar to have. Yeah, on your YouTube channel, he's a very smart guy.
right. So thank you, Stephen, and hope that this is something that provokes some of you to dig deeper and investigate for yourself and see how you fall on this issue. Thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, and then I'm gonna